It's now just about 6 minutes after 8 o'clock. Welcome back. Hour number 2 of the program. I want to thank Flagstaff Vice Mayor Miranda Sweet for spending a couple segments with us in our first hour. We're going to keep it going, and we will get to your emails, phone calls, but don't forget jkshow@kaff.com. Mm-hmm. You can weigh in by phone, 928-773-1346, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But it's actually a pleasure to be joined by one of our Young Voices contributors, Sam Ross. He has joined us a few times before. Sam, welcome back to the program. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing really well. Thank you so much for your time this morning. Hey, listen, your most recent op-ed, Going Once, Going Twice, Let's Auction Some Broadband. And you open your piece by suggesting that auctioning off broadband spectrum could spur economic growth. So what kind of growth are we talking about, and who benefits the most from these auctions?
Yeah, absolutely. Over the past few years, we've seen broadband, which is the waves that we use for cellular connection, for the new 5G, for all sorts of telecommunications, but also for the connectivity of us to the internet and the usage of artificial intelligence across the country, etc. These are the critical wavelengths needed for that interconnection. And so currently about 60% of broadband is still owned by the federal government. It's predominantly owned by the Department of Defense. And as we see these industries try to grow, as we see a real push in particularly to reach rural communities, there's a need for more broadband to be owned by the private sector so that the existing companies, the AT&Ts and Verizon, as well as some of the new startups that are entering the field and trying to compete with new technology, are able to reach as many Americans as possible, connect us, and accelerate our economic growth, particularly some of our technology sectors, a lot of our online jobs, a lot of e-commerce, a lot of different platforms that are connected through telecommunications, and that extends into trucking, that extends into telemarketing and retail sales. And it really transcends more than just one industry, for sure.
So you argue that the federal government can't adapt fast enough to market forces, especially with the technologies like AI and blockchain rapidly evolving. So how does privatizing spectrum access help solve that problem? Yeah,
so as most of us know, the federal government moves at a somewhat glacial pace. It relies so heavily on legislation, even in sectors where the executive has a lot of power, and the current administration is able to move quite quickly. Technological development requires a lot of innovation, a lot of trial and error, a lot of adapting to what the consumers want. And ultimately, if a new cell phone comes out and people aren't a huge fan of it, they'll complain, and the company will adapt and adjust the model to meet the needs of the people. And so auctioning off this broadband would both help offset some of the expenses of the government. It would help raise revenue to pay down the debt, maybe pay for some of the incoming reconciliation bill. But it would also allow for these companies to begin using this spectrum. And I'm not a technical expert on the spectrum, but from what I understand, AI, 5G, some of these new technologies require a different usage of it than is traditionally done. They're accelerating the pace at which information is sent. They're connecting different types of technology in different ways. And that allows for these people to do that freely rather than potentially trying to do it through the Department of Defense. And there's particularly a lot of concerns about that intersect and the vulnerability that it would put the Department of Defense in terms of some of our national security apparatus, and making sure those are two very separate things, letting the businesses flourish independently in the private sector so that we can all have our needs met and have new technology, new goods, better jobs, better connection, etc.
You bet. And Sam Ross, he's a national published political analyst and public relations professional. His op-ed is entitled Going Once, Going Twice, Let's Auction Some Broadband, America. So you highlight the Department of Defense as this major spectrum holder. So how should Congress, or how can Congress navigate the tensions then between national security interest and the need for innovation?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this field in particularly, the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House already accepted this proposal to have auctioning included in the reconciliation bill. But I think that going forward, there's definitely going to be a lot of need for legislation to particularly address what sectors of technology are truly impacting the Department of Defense, and where really there's a lot of speculative claims with regard to artificial intelligence and threats that it may pose, but there's little leeway being given to the side that really most of this technology is going to be used by independent consumers for changes to maybe how we write emails or how we conduct some of our work, how we learn information. It's not. I think there's a lot of concerns being blown out of speculation, and so there needs to be a much hesitation before implementing new regulations that would make this, really fall under the national security apparatus, and it needs to be really tailored to specific needs, specific issues within our Defense Department, for sure.
So given America's caution around foreign ownership of sensitive infrastructure such as farmland and TikTok, how do we ensure spectrum auctions don't end up empowering adversaries like China?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned this in the piece, but I think that it's reasonable to expect, especially with those in power in the House and Senate right now, to have some stipulations included in the auctioning legislation with regards to foreign ownership, whether that would be specifically in line with the president's goals of made in America and owned in America, or whether that would be a little bit broader. I think for the most part, our telecommunications today in this country are predominantly American companies. These are, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile. And so those are the most likely companies to first and foremost bid for this auction, but I'm sure that there will be some startups and other predominantly American-based firms. But I'm sure there's going to be some small clauses included there to make sure that this, is not bought up by any particular Chinese company, for sure.
So do you see spectrum privatization as an issue where bipartisan cooperation is even possible, or is this another one of those issues that's going to get swallowed up in the usual political gridlock?
I think that I haven't particularly followed the legislative politics of this decision and whether or not it has bipartisan support, but I think there's a reasonable understanding that particularly rural broadband access has become a priority of both parties. There was a number of initiatives that the Biden administration attempted to do to expand access to rural communities to be connected to the internet, to telecommunications, so that we have a more interlocked economy. So I think there's certainly room for it, but it remains to be seen whether or not the Democrats could get on board with something like privatization.
Some critics might argue that auctioning off public resources like spectrum is just another way of enriching private companies. So how would you respond to that concern?
Yeah, well, I think that at the end of the day, what needs to be recognized is that all this spectrum that's currently being owned by the Department of Defense is largely unused. So this is akin to resources just kind of sitting in a warehouse and not being able to be converted into goods and services that the American people need. I think that there's going to be concerns with big business purchasing this all up, but I think that there's certainly a lot of room for expanded spectrum in the private sector to be available for startups to give leeway for little tech to compete and for a new firm to emerge in this sector, maybe multiple. But I don't think that that at the end of the day falls in line with the consumer choice and the concerns of the American people in terms of the resources and technology that they need in their everyday lives.
Hey, Sam, I want to get you out on this. How far behind, honestly, is the U.S. when it comes to next-gen connectivity? And could auctioning spectrum help us catch up?
Well, I think that we are certainly far ahead of Europe and maybe some of the other Western countries that seem to still rely on remember the days when we used to buy cellular data by the gigabyte. Now we pretty much all have unlimited data. That still is much more common in other countries. We certainly are less reliant on Wi-Fi access and such. But being such a large country, being a country with a lot of remote areas, a lot of mountainous areas, a lot of rural heartland, there's certainly still a big need for us to get ahead of other countries. And I'm not no expert on telecommunications in China or other places, but I'm sure that their state-down approach certainly has tried to aggressively surveil the entire country. We don't do that here, but we certainly want Americans in places out in the middle of the country, out in our Rocky Mountains and the Appalachian Trail to have access to the same broadband you can get in New York City or Los Angeles.
Well, and finally, and I know I was going to get you out on the other one, but I just wanted to touch on this because President Trump's push for government reform has often leaned heavily on social media stunts, audits, and that sort of thing. But yet you suggest that that's not a sustainable strategy. So, that real effective reform, and I know we could spend probably an hour on this, but quickly, without using those type of stunts, what does real reform look like?
Well, I certainly think he has been effective in gaining the public's attention, but now's the time for us to see legislation pass. I mean, legislation at the end of the day passed into law is how you enact change that sticks for a generation or two, or potentially even longer. I think there's a lot of concern that the DOGE initiative, which is seemingly wrapping up some of the other goals that are being reached, are not going to ultimately be reflected in this reconciliation bill, not going to be reflected in a permanent change in Washington. And so getting bills passed that truly make these changes, truly reform the size and the scope of the government, how much spending is being done, how much taxes are being raised, that's going to need to happen. Otherwise, this will all have been really for nothing.
Absolutely. Sam, always a pleasure talking to you. Sam Raus, nationally published political analyst, public relations professional, and, of course, Young Voices contributor. Go check out the op-ed, Going Once, Going Twice. Let's auction some broadband America. Sam, always a pleasure talking to you, my friend. We'll talk to you again down the line.
Thank you so much for having me. And your listeners can find me on X at SamRouse1.
Very good. Sam Raus, thank you for correcting that pronunciation, too. Hey,
okay.
Thank you, buddy. Appreciate it.